This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
Well, thank you very much, Cleves, and good evening, everyone. Precisely 80 years ago today, the American stock market on Wall Street suffered its worst crash in history. It fell on a Tuesday that year, and ever since that terrible day has been remembered as Black Tuesday. Now, some of you may think that it takes some nerve for a biographer of Herbert Hoover to show up tonight to mark the anniversary. But whether it be a case of chutzpah on my part, or as I prefer to think, a commitment to sound scholarship, it is truly a pleasure and an honor to be with you this evening. So thank you again, Cleves, for your most gracious introduction and for your kind reference to my new book. And my thanks also to the staff of the Hauenstein Center, and to Mr. Ralph Hauenstein, its founder and benefactor, and to Elaine Didier, Jim Kratzis, and their colleagues here at the Gerald Ford Museum, and to Joe Calvaruso of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for all of the hospitality that all of you have extended to me today. I come here tonight neither to praise Herbert Hoover nor to bury him, but to understand him, and in the process to rescue him from some of the mythology that now surrounds his name. The distinguished historian John Lukács likes to say that the principal task of a historian is the reduction of untruth. The reduction of at least a few half-truths is one of my aims in this lecture. Often it seems that Herbert Hoover has become the Rodney Dangerfield of American politics. He gets no respect. Other unpopular presidents like Woodrow Wilson and Harry Truman have recovered their reputations posthumously. A few, like Ronald Reagan, have lived to see their ratings rise. Some presidents whom historians deem mediocre, such as Grover Cleveland and William Howard Taft, are conceded in retrospect to have possessed commendable integrity. But not Hoover, at least not in our media and political culture of 2009. Consider the evidence. A few years ago, in 2004 to be exact, a caravan of 51 unemployed Americans descended on the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum in West Branch, Iowa. They were part of a national Show Us the Jobs tour organized by the AFL-CIO. Upon reaching the Hoover Library grounds, the travelers disembarked from their buses, lined up near the museum entrance, unfurled a Show Us the Jobs banner, and had themselves photographed. Why did they stop in West Branch? Because, explained one of the organizers, George Bush is the first president since Herbert Hoover to have a net job loss. This was 2004. We're just here, she said, to acknowledge Herbert Hoover. Acknowledgement indeed. The tour group did not bother to visit his museum. Having staged their photo op, they reboarded their buses and moved on. Their stay in West Branch lasted just 12 minutes. The Show Us the Jobs media event is emblematic of the use to which Hoover's name was being put in that election year and is being put even now. Across the land, political opponents of President Bush in 2004 were reciting the argument that he was the first president to lose jobs since Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression. Whatever one may think of the statistical basis for this charge, the intention of Bush's critics was clear: to tie him rhetorically to a man perceived by the critics to have been a presidential failure. What was happening here? And what is happening here? Why was Hoover suffering once more from a bad press? At one level, the answer is obvious. Like consumer confidence data and the monthly unemployment rate, Hoover has become an economic indicator. Whenever the economy falters, the mention of his name shoots up. Today, 45 years after his death and more than 70 after his presidency, he remains a historical punching bag, a symbol of hard times, ineptitude, and indifference. The development of this symbolism was not exactly accidental during his lifetime. During Hoover's administration between 1929 and 1933, the Democratic Party's chief publicist and spinmeister, a man named Charles Michelson, orchestrated an unremitting barrage of disparagement of Hoover's shortcomings in press releases. It was a foretaste of what a later generation would call the politics of personal destruction. As the economy worsened, the nation's travails were increasingly personalized. Millions of bewildered Americans were looking for a scapegoat, and Hoover became it. It was not the Great Depression, it was the Hoover Depression. Shanty towns of the homeless were called Hoovervilles. The insides of trouser pockets were called Hoover handkerchiefs. Newspapers were called Hoover blankets. Armadillos were called Hoover hogs. The temptation to interpret the Depression as a giant morality play, replete with heroes and knaves, did not abate when Hoover left office. Franklin Roosevelt perceived the world in such judgmental terms. In his 1933 inaugural address, he roundly denounced the nation's money changers, as he called them, the bankers, as the villains in the drama, and vowed to restore, as he called it, the temple of our civilization to the ancient truths. Later on in his first term, he castigated those he labeled economic royalists and pledged ominously to make himself their master. For years to come, at election time, Roosevelt and his Democratic successors ran against Hoover. In 1948, President Harry Truman, who privately admired Hoover, nevertheless lambasted him on the hustings. If the Republicans win the election, he claimed, it will bring back the era of the Hoover cart. Quote, the remains of the old Tin Lizzie being pulled by a mule because you couldn't afford to buy a new car and you couldn't afford to buy gas for the old one. That was Truman speaking. The Hoover cart, he said, was the only automobile in the world that eats oats. And so it goes whenever the economy weakens. In 1987, as some of you may recall, when the stock market suddenly plummeted, allusions to Hoover and the crash of 1929 quickly filled the airwaves, and films of Depression-era breadlines appeared on television. In 1992, when President George Herbert Walker Bush ran for re-election at the end of a recession, you may recall that some of his leading opponents ridiculed him as George Herbert Hoover Walker Bush. Old habits among politicians die hard. Today's critics of Hoover on the left, then, are heirs to a long and by now reflexive tradition of political oratory. To them, he is little more than an advertising slogan of a sort, a Pavlovian stimulus meant to elicit an emotional response. Hoover, depression. Hoover, unemployment. Hoover, Republicans. It is pro-New Deal historiography reduced to a pejorative catchphrase. But if Hoover wins little respect these days among Democrats, where are his defenders among Republicans? The answer is almost nowhere, and therein lies another curious tale. During Hoover's long and productive ex-presidency, he lived longer as an ex-president than any other holder of the White House office, he came to be revered by many in the GOP. His philippics against the New Deal inspired many of the party faithful. A patron of Human Events magazine, the Freeman magazine, and other conservative causes, he was admired as a benevolent grandfather figure on the American right. To his liberal opponents and a considerable number of voters in those years, his name continued to connote hard times and failed leadership. But to his conservative supporters, it conveyed an image of resilient rectitude. When Hoover died in 1964, however, his political comeback died with him. And within a decade and a half, his image radically changed. In the 1980s, rather even before then, it was changing, but late in his life, just before he died, he was being acclaimed as the greatest Republican of his generation. So you might say his life ended on a note of greater respect. But by the 1980s, he was being likened on the right to Jimmy Carter, who at least at that time was being considered a failed president and being often compared to Hoover. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, one of his first acts was to hang a portrait of Calvin Coolidge in a prominent place in the White House. During his presidency, Reagan was known to quote Franklin Roosevelt, but not Hoover in his speeches. Reagan himself was not publicly critical of his Republican predecessor, but among a rising generation of conservative pundits and politicians, Hoover fell completely from favor. What happened? In the 1970s, a new conservative orthodoxy known as supply-side economics was born. And I think perhaps some of you have heard a bit about it this fall if you've been attending other events sponsored by the Hauenstein Center. Led by the free market economist Arthur Laffer, the writer Jude Wanniski, Representative Jack Kemp, and the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, the supply-siders built a powerful case for the reduction of tax rates as the answer to the oppressive stagflation of the Carter years. Their arguments became the intellectual foundation for the so-called Reagan Revolution and the dominant economic paradigm of the Republican Party to this day. Searching for historical precedents to buttress their policy agenda, the supply-siders extolled the tax-cutting program of Calvin Coolidge and his conservative Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, as well as the tax cuts propounded by John F. Kennedy 40 years later. Significantly, they did not turn in the least to Herbert Hoover. In the eyes of the evangelical supply-siders, Hoover had committed two disastrous blunders. First, in 1930, he had signed into law the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, a protectionist measure which, in their view, fractured the world economy and converted the crisis of 1929 into a catastrophe. Second, in late 1931 and 1932, Hoover had proposed, and a Democratic-dominated Congress had enacted, a massive tax increase in a desperate effort to balance the federal budget. It was the largest percentage peacetime tax cut, or tax increase rather, in American history. It was a precedent which naturally did not appeal to conservative Reaganites in the 1980s or since. And that was it. Supply-side theorists and devotees showed little interest in any other part of Hoover's record. His belief in voluntarism, for example, or his social philosophy grounded in the principle and ideal of equal opportunity. Few remarked upon the extent to which, during the campaign of 1932 and elsewhere, he battled against Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Few noticed that Hoover's books, American Individualism, published in 1922, and The Challenge to Liberty, published in 1934, articulated a vision of American exceptionalism and a critique of statism that conservatives might study with profit. Few noticed his manifold contributions to conservative causes during his ex-presidency. Above all, perhaps, his building of the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace, which he came to regard as his greatest benefaction to the American people. For present-minded activists of the 80s and 90s, Hoover's overall record of public service seemed less important than just two things: the alleged effects of his tax and tariff policies. Like the do-nothing Hoover of liberal caricature, the Hoover of supply-side economic orthodoxy became a cardboard figure, a rhetorical weapon to deploy against political foes. To Jack Kemp and other popularizers of the new doctrine, Hoover was synonymous with dour, fetishistic, old-fashioned, balance-the-budget conservatism, a shop-worn and defensive ideology which they hoped to expel from the Republican Party. Time and again, Kemp in particular contrasted what he called his optimistic brand of republicanism with what he derisively called Hooverism. Thus, even in what might be considered his natural constituency, Hoover became a political outcast whose name is rarely invoked except in criticism. Among libertarian thinkers today and those influenced by their scholarship, he tends to be perceived not as one of us, but as one of them. I would like to suggest to you that both of these stereotypes, the liberal one and the conservative one, are based in part upon mythology. The first myth, the liberal one, the one that most people in this audience probably grew up on, is that Hoover was a timid conservative who, as president, responded too little and too late to the challenge of the Great Depression. But Hoover, in the fall of 1929, was not an unalloyed conservative like his predecessor, Calvin Coolidge. He was an unabashed conservative activist for his time and a self-styled Republican of the progressive Republican brand who had supported Theodore Roosevelt for president in the Bull Moose campaign of 1912. Hoover's temperament and mindset were on full display that autumn. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, he did his best to mitigate its impact. As Hoover saw it, the recent long upward trend of fundamental progress, his words, had given rise to what he called over-optimism as to profits, followed by a wave of uncontrollable speculation in securities, a diversion of capital from business to the stock market, and the inevitable crash. Thanks, he said, to quick action by the Federal Reserve Board right after the crash, action to reduce interest rates and pump credit into the banking system, the volatility in the stock market had been completely isolated from the rest of the economy. For the first time in history, he asserted on November 5th, just a week or so after the crash, the crisis has been isolated to the stock market itself. Or had it? As the turmoil of late October gave way to the hangover of November, a new and more menacing reality intruded. The cataclysm had not been confined to Wall Street. The national psyche itself had suffered a terrific shock. In mid-November, Hoover informed the press that the collapse of the stock market had created an undue state of alarm in what he called the American mind. Hoover did not believe that this new mood was justified. But he could not ignore the fact that the debacle on Wall Street had created fear, uncertainty, and hesitation in business. Hesitation which, if unchecked, said Hoover, could plunge the economy into a depression. By mid-November, he was under growing pressure from his friends, his advisors, and the press to step forward as a national cheerleader and arrest the spreading miasma of fear. Hoover now took steps which changed the direction of American history. Instead of allowing the business downturn to run its course, as Andrew Mellon recommended, he intervened in the emergency on a scale unmatched by any previous president. Convinced that the nation's difficulties were, in his words, psychological rather than logical, he launched a national campaign to alter not the economy itself, but false perceptions of it. In November and December 1929, Hoover dominated the national stage with his unprecedented activism. He convened conferences at the White House of business leaders who enthusiastically pledged, in defiance of classical economic theory, to maintain current wage scales and carry on business as usual. He conferred with national labor leaders who promised not to seek destabilizing wage increases during the crisis. To counter an expected rise in unemployment, he persuaded prominent employers to expand construction projects in every prudent direction. An increase in construction and maintenance work, he asserted, would be a great balance wheel of stability. He pledged that the federal government would do its utmost to increase its own public works expenditures. He asked the nation's governors to do the same. To Hoover, these measures were not eccentric nostrums. Indeed, they reflected the teachings of the so-called new economics that he and many others had been touting during the 1920s. Wise or foolish, his policies had substantial support among economists and opinion leaders throughout the nation. In effect, Hoover was practicing psychiatric therapy, designed to restore his patients' badly needed confidence. The purpose of his plan, he told a group of reporters, was to disabuse the public mind of the notion that there has been any serious or vital interruption in our economic system. Everything, he said reassuringly, was going to proceed in the ordinary, normal manner. By sustaining wage rates, by avoiding labor unrest, and by fostering employment through enhanced construction spending, he would soothe the nation's badly rattled nerves. By stabilizing the economy, he would defeat the fear of unemployment and the emotions that threatened an economic breakdown. By early December, barely 3 weeks after he started, the presidential psychologist was convinced that he had succeeded. Confidence has been reestablished, he told Congress in his State of the Union message on December 3rd. A very large degree of industrial unemployment and suffering which would otherwise have occurred has been prevented. Wages, and therefore consuming power, should remain stable, he reported. And capital, which had previously been absorbed in stock market loans for speculative purposes, as he described them, capital was now returning to the normal channels of business. Hoover was proud of the extraordinary agreements that he had forged with industrial leaders. This is a far cry, he told them, from the arbitrary and dog-eat-dog attitude of the business world of some 30 or 40 years ago. It was a far cry, too, from the traditional governmental policy of laissez-faire, a doctrine he had previously and publicly condemned as archaic and unscientific. Confidently, deliberately, and self-consciously, he had abandoned the principle of political non-interference with the economy. As never before, the President of the United States had placed one man, himself, in charge of guiding it back to prosperity. And having done so, Hoover was eager to proclaim early success. At a press conference on March 7, 1930, he stated that all the evidences indicate that the worst effects of the crash upon employment will have passed during the next 60 days. Almost 60 days later, the cheerleader turned prophet was nearly ready to proclaim victory. In an address on May 1, 1930, to the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, he declared that his great economic experiment, and he used that word to describe what he was doing, of cooperation between government and the entire community had succeeded to a remarkable degree. He said, "While the crash only took place 6 months ago, I am convinced that we have now passed the worst, and with continued unity of effort, we shall rapidly recover." 1 month later, on June 4th, he went all the way. To a delegation of citizens demanding a gigantic increase of federal public works expenditures to relieve unemployment, he replied that the economic tide had already turned. "Gentlemen," he told them, "you have come 6 weeks too late." Hoover's sanguine prophecies of early 1930 eventually cost him dearly in public disillusionment. But at the time, they did not seem so outlandish. Many other prestigious and seasoned observers, if you'll go back and look at the evidence, such as the National Business Survey Conference, also believed that the worst was or very soon would be over. Business was returning to normal. Business leaders repeatedly assured Hoover no further emergency stimulus package was needed. In the winter and early spring of 1930, in fact, the stock market itself gradually rebounded. And I just might add parenthetically that during that first year or so, people did not think that this was the catastrophe that we now know it became. They thought of it as a sharp, but in a sense, traditional kind of downturn. So Hoover was not alone in feeling optimistic, but of course those words came back to haunt him. To Hoover, these growing signs of recovery during the winter and early spring of 1930 vindicated his interventionist leadership. At the Gridiron Club's annual dinner in April 1930, he asserted triumphantly that the miseries of unemployment from speculative crashes were being cured before our eyes. It was being accomplished, he said, not by government doles or unemployment insurance, as some were now demanding, but, in his words again, by voluntary cooperation of industry with the government in maintaining wages against reduction and the intensification of construction work. A few nights later, speaking before the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he again touted his experiment in confidence building as a remarkable success. Once again forsaking the traditional path of laissez-faire, Hoover denied that the business cycle was a disease which must run its course without intervention. I do not accept the fatalistic view, he declared, that the discovery of the means to restrain destructive speculation is beyond the genius of the American people. On the contrary, the progressive Republican engineer seemed convinced that he had found the antidote in voluntary cooperative action outside government, action that he as president had instigated and promoted. By late spring, increasing numbers of Americans were not so sure. Across the country, unemployment seemed to be rising. The day after Hoover told the Chamber of Commerce that the worst was over, the stock market plunged in the heaviest trading of the year. Meanwhile, in mid-June, after months of heated haggling and recrimination, Congress enacted, and Hoover reluctantly approved, the protectionist Smoot-Hawley tariff. The law raised the nation's tariff schedules to what critics cried were the highest levels in American history. Low-tariff Democrats accused Hoover of cowardice and howled that the tariff wall would throttle foreign trade and devastate the American economy. Hoover took solace from the law's flexible rate provision, which permitted him, upon recommendation by the Tariff Commission, to actually raise or lower rates by 50%. In this way, he reasoned, he could take the messy tariff issue out of politics and adjust rates on a scientific basis. By wise administration, then, he hoped that he could mitigate the tariff's ill effects. This leads me to a second myth about Hoover's handling of the Great Depression. Most of you are no doubt familiar with the storyline. The highly protectionist Smoot-Hawley tariff is said to have been an infamous act of legislative folly, which raised American tariffs so high on imports that it ruined international trade and turned the slump of 1929 into the Great Depression. Lately, I have been investigating this storyline, and I must tell you that much of the scholarly literature on this subject does not sustain this interpretation. It seems that the Smoot-Hawley tariff was not the highest tariff in American history. Its overall rates were not much higher than those already in place under the existing Fordney-McCumber tariff of 1922, a highly protectionist piece of legislation that did not seem to interfere with the prosperity of the 1920s. Even after the Smoot-Hawley tariff was enacted, nearly 2/3 of America's imports were subject to no import duties at all. Moreover, according to some academic specialists, there is little evidence that the Smoot-Hawley tariff had a major negative impact on the course of the Depression. One distinguished economic historian, Barry Eichengreen, has even found evidence that the tariff initially gave a boost to the domestic U.S. economy. Nor is there compelling evidence, it appears, that the tariff triggered massive retaliation by foreign countries, as is often claimed, leading then to an international trade war. With the possible exception of Canada, foreign retaliation in the form of higher tariffs on our exports appears not to have been as severe as once thought. In fact, much more modest than once thought. Now, to be sure, as the Depression deepened, American exports shrank dramatically. But according to some studies, the decline did not correlate with the new tariff rates. Other factors, such as Great Britain's abandonment of the gold standard in 1931, seem to have been more consequential. We must also remember that during Hoover's presidency, U.S. foreign trade constituted a very small fraction of our economy, accounting for perhaps 4 to 5% of the gross national product. In short, a number of historians and economists have concluded that there was little relationship between the much vilified Smoot-Hawley tariff and the actual course of the Great Depression. In the words of one of these scholars, Alfred Eckes, Smoot-Hawley is a molehill, not a mountain. Now, I am not inferring from this that the tariff legislation of 1930 was a good thing. My own research leads me to suspect otherwise. But after delving into the scholarly literature on this subject, I am not persuaded that the Smoot-Hawley tariff had anything like the vast explanatory significance that is so routinely attributed to it by some on the left and the right. Well then, if the Smoot-Hawley tariff did not necessarily make the Great Depression great, what about Hoover's huge tax increase of 1932? As I mentioned earlier, in mid-1932, near the nadir of the Depression, the Congress of the United States, under Hoover's prodding, enacted a massive increase in taxes. Before we recoil in horror at this deviation from our current orthodoxies, let us look at the record more closely. In fiscal year 1932, as the Depression intensified, the United States government incurred its largest peacetime deficit to date in American history. The shortfall approached a staggering 60% of all federal expenditures. Faced with a peacetime fiscal drain of unprecedented proportions, what was President Hoover to do? He could try, at least in theory, to make up the deficit by borrowing and thus increase the federal debt. But that, he believed, and he was not alone in so thinking, would simply overwhelm the private money markets and soak up precious capital badly needed for private investment and recovery. Nor could Hoover simply sit back and do nothing. For 150 years, the federal government had always attempted, except in wartime, to balance its budget. This was the regnant orthodoxy of 1932, an orthodoxy so powerful that Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats denounced Hoover in the election campaign for extravagant, unsound, radical economics, and pledged the Democrats to institute both a balanced federal budget and a 25% reduction in federal expenditure if Roosevelt were elected. While Hoover himself had not in the past been an inflexible adherent of a balanced budget, he too, in early 1932, publicly declared that a balanced budget was now, under the circumstances, an absolute necessity. Why? In part because Hoover and most political and economic and business leaders believed exactly what he argued, that a balanced budget was the very keystone of real recovery, the bedrock of restored public confidence. Confidence, with the consequent flow of credit to business, was, in Hoover's judgment, the key. If the U.S. government could not control its own finances, how could economic recovery begin? But there was a second and probably more compelling reason for Hoover's tax decision. On September 21st, 1931, Great Britain rocked the world by abandoning the gold standard. The United States, however, still struggled to maintain it. This meant that every dollar was legally convertible to gold, both at home and abroad. At once, the frightening effects of Britain's action became manifest. Gold flowed in record quantities out of the United States, $712 million in 6 weeks, and that was a lot of money in those days. If the British pound sterling fell, many wondered, could the embattled dollar be far behind? Moreover, many nervous American depositors now withdrew currency from our banks, thereby helping to generate a tsunami of bank failures. 512 American banks failed in 1 month, October 1931, the month after Great Britain left the gold standard. Bank reserves in this country plummeted by over $1 billion, an enormous sum at that time, in just 6 weeks. Hoarding set in, and the nation's credit structure became more paralyzed than ever. And now, against this disconcerting backdrop, the federal government's deficit was reaching a staggering magnitude. So I ask again, what was the President of the United States to do? Confronted with what Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, the great conservative, himself called a grave emergency, Hoover opted to raise taxes and cut federal spending in order to balance the budget. The first requirement of confidence and of economic recovery, he said in late 1931, is financial stability of the United States government. And that meant a balanced budget, even via new taxes. This, I repeat, was the prevailing doctrine throughout the country in 1932. This was the standard economic thinking of the time. Hoover's call for increased taxes, in fact, won widespread bipartisan support in Congress. Few politicians or economists challenged his rationale. Indeed, the only real debate in Congress for several months was not over whether to raise taxes, but how, which taxes to raise. Incredible though it may now seem, nobody of influence in 1932 called for a tax cut to stimulate the economy. Even Andrew Mellon, the hero of today's tax cutters, endorsed a tax increase that year. In assessing the impact of Hoover's decision, it is important to keep some perspective on the dimensions of federal spending at that time. The federal government in Hoover's era was small. In 1929, total federal expenditures comprised a mere 2.5% of the gross national product. Today, they approach 25%. Moreover, from 1929 to 1932, while Hoover was president, the federal income tax structure was almost unbelievably low. Of the 36 million or so families and unattached individuals in this country in 1929, 36 million, barely 4 million even filed tax returns. Throughout Hoover's presidency, and even after the tax hike of 1932, the vast majority of the American people paid no federal income taxes whatsoever. It was not until World War II that most Americans became income tax payers. One must wonder then whether the tax increases of 1932, so often condemned today as a monumental policy error, had anything like the dire economic and political consequences now attributed to them. My point, however, is not to assert that the tax increase of 1932 was wise. Seen in retrospect, after 7 decades of developing economic knowledge and changing economic orthodoxy, Hoover's decision is now commonly regarded by historians and economists as a mistake. Raising taxes during hard times is now considered counterproductive by both Keynesians and supply-side economists alike. But we must remember that Hoover and his contemporaries did not have the benefit of today's supposedly, presumably, superior economic wisdom. This decision was made 4 years before Keynes wrote his famous general theory and 44 years before the discovery of the Laffer curve. And I'm suggesting that it is not at all clear that the mistake of raising taxes in those circumstances, if mistake it was of the dimensions claimed by much current mythology. Very well, you may say, but what then did cause the Great Depression? Perhaps the best short answer I can give you is this. I am not sure that historians and economists really know. Ben Bernanke has written, "To understand the Great Depression is the holy grail of macroeconomics." Judging by the furious debates among academics and others in the past year about the causes and cures of the Great Depression and its relationship to the current recession, a true consensus continues to elude us. I will venture this thought. If Milton Friedman and the free market economists are right, that the Federal Reserve Board made things horribly worse in the early 30s by severely contracting the money supply, we may have to conclude from that much of what Herbert Hoover did to combat the Depression's causes was largely irrelevant, or at least far less consequential than his critics allege. Where Hoover fell short, it seems to me, was not so much in his specific economic policies as in his political persona as the Depression grew worse. He came into office with the reputation of being a Superman, a great humanitarian who had literally saved the lives of more people than anyone who has ever lived. Yet from the start, there was something enigmatic about him. "Is Hoover human?" was the title of a famous magazine article written about him during the 1928 campaign. Many politicians in his own party disliked him. He seemed too aloof, too independent-minded, too brainy, and he reciprocated their mistrust. He called one senator the only verified case of a negative IQ. On one occasion, while president, he whimsically remarked, "There ought to be a law allowing the president to hang 2 men a year and without being required to give any reason." When his granddaughter was born, his first reaction is supposed to have been, "I'm glad she doesn't have to be confirmed by the Senate." Hoover, I think all will agree, was supremely conscientious as president. He worked prodigiously at his job. Oh, how he worked. From 6 o'clock in the morning until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, 7 days a week, the battle against the Depression consumed his energies to the point that his personal physician was worried that he might suffer a collapse. In a 7-month period in 1931 and 1932, he took not a single day off. But as the nation's suffering increased and burst beyond the capacity of the traditional relief system to alleviate it, this aggressive introvert, as he has been called, seemed unable to communicate empathy, a skill we now expect of our presidents. You will not find many photographs of President Hoover grinning broadly. The big smile, as a political pose, came in with Franklin Roosevelt. And here I have to pause just for a moment and tell you a story back in my home state of Massachusetts. In 1970, there was a man named Maurice Donahue, a state senator from my area, who ran for governor of Massachusetts. He had been president of the state senate for a number of years. He was considered a very distinguished and accomplished legislator. But he had a rather stern and sober visage and was uncharismatic in appearance. He tried to compensate for this with his campaign slogan, "Donahue, he doesn't smile, What's so funny about the state we're in? He lost. When I think of Herbert Hoover, I sometimes think of Mr. Donohue's fate. It may be that Hoover fell short not so much for the way he dealt with the economic causes of the Great Depression, but for the seemingly austere way he dealt with its effects, particularly unemployment and the need for relief. He truly cared, I believe, but it did not show enough, and for that he paid a steep political price. I leave you with these final questions. What are the overriding lessons of the Hoover presidency? On what grounds may he properly be criticized? For intervening in the economic crisis too little? Or did he intervene too often and too much? This, it seems to me, is the crucial question, one with profound implications for our national self-understanding and future public policy. It is a question that historians are still debating 80 years after the crash. As you ponder these issues, I beseech you, be wary of the pitfalls of present-minded preoccupations and the lure of soundbite certitudes. With Herbert Hoover or anyone else, resist the temptation to select a sliver of the past as a basis for broad historical judgment. Above all, remember the context. For starters, why not indulge in a little political theater suitable for our times? Why not invite that busload of unemployed back to the Hoover Library in Iowa and bring along the media to cover the story? But let the story be this. Have the viewers spend the day inside the library instead of a mere 12 minutes on the front lawn. Thank you. Please, did you want to say something or start off? Yes.
George, I have a question for you. You know, you have spoken in a very interesting way about the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover in 1920. And it's quite a different picture of the relationship, say, from 1932. Could you expound on that?
Right. Oh, okay, yes. Well, if I may mention, I'm writing a book on the relationship between Hoover and FDR. We all know that they were political opponents, but what most people don't know, and what Gleaves is alluding to, is that early on in their careers in public life, they were friends. They became acquainted during World War I when both served in the Woodrow Wilson administration. And they were not intimate friends, but they were cordial and dined occasionally. They had mutual friends and so forth. Well, pardon me. In 1920, Woodrow Wilson, excuse me, although invalided really at that point from a stroke, wanted to run again for a third term. Well, this was impossible, but the desperate Democrats were looking for someone who could pick up his mantle and be his political heir. They needed a candidate for president. And Hoover, who had served in the Wilson administration as food administrator and then as relief director in Europe, had a tremendous positive reputation at that time as a kind of nonpartisan administrator. And he also was thought of as a progressive. Franklin Roosevelt went to Hoover with another man and urged him to run for president as a Democrat. And they said they thought he had a real shot at getting the nomination. And I have concluded from my research that if Hoover had accepted that plea, he might very well have been the Democratic nominee for president in 1920. But Hoover really didn't trust the Democrats. He said there were too many radicals in the Democratic Party, there were too many reactionaries in the Republican Party, and for a while he basically didn't take sides and said, I'm an independent progressive, and I'll throw in with the party that has the more progressive platform. Well, ultimately, he went back to his pre-war progressive Republican roots and became a known Republican and rejected the temptation, the offer to go over with the Democrats. Well, as this was unfolding, someone came to Franklin Roosevelt, pardon me while I clear my throat, and said, you know, we Democrats are desperate, but I have the perfect ticket. Hoover of California for president and Franklin Roosevelt of New York for his running mate. Roosevelt liked that idea. He said, go to it. That sounds like a pretty good thought, and so forth. And he let this Democratic activist, who was Justice Louis Brandeis's nephew, go out and kind of start beating the drums for a Hoover-Roosevelt ticket. Well, that tells you something. Roosevelt admired Hoover, and in fact, at the beginning of 1920, he wrote to a friend of Hoover, he says, I wish we could make Hoover President of the United States. There could not be a better one. And I'm quoting verbatim there. So Hoover and Roosevelt were not only friendly at that point, but Roosevelt was an admirer of Hoover. Mrs. Roosevelt, who was very serious and high-minded, I think is perhaps more attuned to Hoover's personality than FDR was. Mrs. Roosevelt had great respect for Hoover. So there was a moment then when I think maybe Hoover was tempted and toyed with the idea, and we might have seen a Hoover-Roosevelt ticket of all things in 1920. Well, Roosevelt in a way got his wish. He was the vice presidential candidate, some of you trivia buffs will remember, with Cox of Ohio, but of course Roosevelt and Cox lost the election to Harding and Coolidge. Hoover and Roosevelt remained friendly through the 20s, but various things started to happen in the 1928 campaign and afterward, which made each of them feel that the other was not behaving in a gentlemanly manner, that each was becoming really too partisan. I could go on at some length about the details I won't here, but at any rate, the friendship started to taper off, although there was a certain amount of public formality and so on involved. And of course, eventually they not only became political enemies, but those personal misunderstandings and friction really curdled the friendship, and they never really were friends again. They never met again after the day Roosevelt was inaugurated, but there was some indirect contact between them, and well, again, that's part of a story that I'll be telling in a book that I'm writing. But that, I think, probably sufficiently answers the point that most people don't know, that Roosevelt and Hoover were socially friendly, and that Roosevelt wanted Hoover to run, and even wanted to be Hoover's running mate, I believe, in 1920. So, is there perhaps another question out there, or how do you want to proceed? I see one in the middle. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Harry Truman. How did Truman and Hoover get along?
They got along pretty well. As you know, or may know, Hoover and Roosevelt never met after 1933, so when Roosevelt died in 45, Truman brought Hoover to the White House a few weeks after Truman became president. That was the first time that Hoover set foot in the White House since his departure on March 4th, 1933. And I think partly Truman was was trying to make a gesture. After all, FDR just died, the war was still on. Hoover was a major leader of the opposition. Also, Truman felt that FDR had not treated Hoover rightly. He said, I think I'm going to try to quote fairly closely now, he said, Hoover's politics may be to the right of Louis XIV. You can hear Harry Truman saying that, but by golly, he was still president of the United States and he deserves respect, or words closely to that effect. And he didn't think that FDR had treated Hoover right. So Truman and Hoover had a subtle bond in that they both, I think, had grievances against FDR. I think Truman felt that FDR had kept him in the dark in those few months that Truman was vice president. So that was one bond. But I think partly Truman thought, I have to make a gesture to Hoover. And he didn't have the animus that had built up against Hoover the way that FDR had. So Truman brought Hoover back into public life. Now, it started with that White House meeting in 1945, but in 1946, much more significantly, Truman asked Hoover to go abroad to, I think, 38 nations, and Hoover was in his 70s, to do a survey of the famine needs around the world in the wake of World War II. And Hoover pushed himself and went, and I think it wasn't a terribly pressurized airplane. I think he suffered hearing loss because of it, but he went around the world and surveyed the needs, met with world leaders, made the pitch that those nations with excess food should send it to where it was needed, etc. And Hoover came back and reported to Truman. This was Hoover reprising the great role that had made him famous before he was president, the role of the nonpartisan humanitarian. So Truman had a lot of respect for Hoover. They didn't agree politically. There was a speech that Truman gave in 1948. It might be the one that I quoted from when he was talking about the Hoover cart. But anyway, Truman was lambasting Hoover, and Hoover was puzzled. And he said, "This man's my friend. How can he say this about me?" And I think Truman's excuse was, "Well, I didn't write it. I was just reading along." But one other thing I should certainly mention in terms of that Hoover-Truman relationship, and that is in 1947, when the Republicans controlled Congress, a commission was set up to reorganize the executive branch that had gotten so bloated with World War II and the New Deal and so on. And by a chain of circumstances that I need not describe in detail, Herbert Hoover was chosen to be president of what then, of course, became known as the Hoover Commission. And Hoover worked with the Truman administration. There were moments of tension. If you look very carefully, Truman did not always give Hoover everything he wanted, but they maintained a friendship. And after Truman left the White House, they belonged to what Hoover said was this trade union of ex-presidents, or some words to that effect. So when the Truman Library, Elaine, you may know this, and Jim and so on, I think when the Truman Library was dedicated in 1957, Hoover was there. And when the Hoover Presidential Library was dedicated in 1962, when Hoover was 88 years old, Harry Truman was present in West Branch, Iowa, and there's a great picture of the two of them smiling and walking together. So they did have a camaraderie. And one other sort of touching point on that, I've come across a letter in my research about 1961-62. Hoover wrote a letter to Truman. I don't recall the catalyst for the letter, but Hoover said something like this: "You don't realize how deeply you have reached into and touched my life." Hoover felt that Truman gave Hoover a kind of reason to live. It gave him he brought him back into a kind of respectability and gave him a role in public service, the Hoover Commission, the relief travels, and so forth. And Hoover felt that that added years to his life. And so he was profoundly grateful to Truman for giving him that opportunity to kind of redeem himself in the eyes of the American people. Another question, perhaps? Yes?
Yeah. In regards to the gold standard in the United Kingdom being changed, is there any theories that are popular and what Hoover could have done in response to that?
From what I've seen, the blame is really being put on the Federal Reserve. I was just reading this afternoon the text of a speech that was given here a couple of weeks ago by a young professor, Brian Dimitrovich, who's written a really excellent book on the supply-side economics phenomenon, a history of it. And I think, as I read quickly his speech, his major point was that the Federal Reserve made some bizarrely bad decisions in terms of dealing with the gold supply. So it's hard to know what Hoover could have done that would have made much difference, given the policy decisions that were being made outside his control that we now think were maybe more important than the puttering with the federal budget. But you see, it's one of those things. Today we live with federal deficits, boy. And we're used to them and expecting them for a long time to come. But this was thought of as horrifyingly irresponsible in 1931 and 32, and everyone said, we've got to do it. Now, maybe in pure economic terms, it wasn't that important. The federal budget was rather small compared to the economy and so forth. However, in a sense, if you believe it, then it takes on a kind of importance of its own. And if you believe Hoover's theory that psychology was very much important in trying to turn things around, that is, getting people to feel confident enough to leave the money in the banks and not in the mattresses at home, and businesses would be confident enough to want to borrow money from banks, and banks would be willing to borrow it or lend it to them. If you believe that confidence is at the center, then it might very well be that a balanced federal budget would look pretty good. Maybe in pure economic terms, it wouldn't make that much difference, but it might symbolically have a lot to do to help other people make decisions in the private sector. And I'm not sure where I come out on that, but it seems to me that it might be that there would have been a point, even in an economic emergency, to making a gesture toward going with the rock solidity of the orthodoxy of the time, not looking too radical, irresponsible. That might have had a psychologically reassuring effect, however unimportant it might seem to us today from our perspective on it all. So it's hard to know what Hoover could have done differently. The Democrats were berating him for being a spendthrift. You know, many in the Democratic Party, this is true in 1932, you know. And the big debate over the tax increase was Hoover came around to wanting what they called a manufacturer's sales tax, a kind of national sales tax. There was a great populist rebellion in the House of Representatives, led mainly by Southerners, but also by progressive Republicans, which defeated it. So down that went in flames, and so they started puttering here, puttering there. They raised income tax rates and raised, I think, the price of a postage stamp from 2 cents to 3 cents and had different excise taxes, all sorts of things to try to shrink that budget gap that looks so dangerously large. But the way I look at it, in part, is you go back and you look at it, well, yes, it's a 50% increase in the cost of postage. That sounds horrible, but it's from 2 cents to 3 cents, which doesn't sound quite so important. And I left some things out of my lecture, but I think after the tax increase of 1932, you had to, if you were a family of 4, you had to be earning something like $4,000, which is quite a lot in 1932, to pay all of $68 in federal income tax. Now, it was higher on the people at the top, and an argument can be made that the people at the top are the ones who are going to invest the money, and therefore you should keep taxes low on the wealthy. We hear, we go round and round on that issue. But it does not strike me on its face that the taxes, whether right or wrong, and maybe they were wrong by our perceptions, you see, but looked right given the mindset of that time, it's not clear to me that those tax increases made the huge amount of difference that people pound upon when they say, oh, Hoover raised taxes, naughty, naughty, bad, bad. Okay, I'm not sure that it's as simple as that. And that is really one of the major points I'm trying to make. Beware of the simplifiers who want us to sort of select one thing and kind of, pound away at it. They may have a point, but as I said at the start, it may be a half-truth rather than the totality of it. And so I guess the way I, as a historian, tend to look at history is that it's not so much a morality play where we choose the good guys and the bad guys and we root for our team and we disparage the other team. It's in a way a tragedy. Tragedy not in the sense that people die, although people often do in terrible events like wars, of course. But it's a tragedy in the sense that we all operate, as we are operating right now, with imperfect knowledge, and we're trying to do the best we can, whether we're in office or not. We're trying to judge on the basis of imperfect knowledge, and mistakes will be made, or what our successors will call mistakes, but it's not so easy to discern that at the time, and especially in a time of great crisis. So I guess I try as a historian to refrain from, as I say, praising Hoover or burying him, or trying to wave the flag for him or denigrate him and so forth. I think that's not terribly helpful. It tends to simplify our understanding of what truly happened, and I think that's where the historian should try to come in, to increase our understanding. And so it's not, again, just to finish up now and answer your question, it's not clear to me what the great alternatives were. And it's not as if the opposing party had a nice agenda at the time that Hoover could logically have looked at and adopted. It was much more murky than that. I see a hand right in the front.
Will you tell us about the role Mrs. Hoover played as a First Lady?
Yes, Mrs. Hoover.
Repeat the question you asked.
What was the role of Mrs. Hoover as First Lady? Lou Henry Hoover was his wife's name. She was the same age as he. She was born in Iowa, a few months ahead of him in 1874, but they met at Stanford University and got married not long after she graduated. And they went to China on their honeymoon. He was a mining engineer. They had quite an adventurous life. They had 2 sons. One of Mrs. Hoover's great causes, she was something of an outdoors woman, and she was of that kind of the stereotypical Western woman, as in Western United States and so on, hiking in Yosemite and doing things like that. Anyway, one of her great causes was the Girl Scout movement. She was the head of the National Girl Scout movement for a number of years. Now, it wasn't expected that first ladies would be up front and center. Now, Grace Coolidge, her immediate predecessor, was very popular because of her rebellion personality, but she was not advising Calvin Coolidge what to do. But she had a certain visibility. Mrs. Hoover did too, but it was nothing like what came after her, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, who did take a very public role in policy matters. So Mrs. Roosevelt didn't have a terribly high profile, but she was, I think, a respected First Lady, and so she wasn't expected to, as I say, intervene or become, go on talk shows if there had been such, or that kind of thing. She made some public speeches, usually of a nonpartisan nature. Really, I can't think of anything that she said that would be thought of as controversial. But it's a little like maybe Laura Bush more recently, or some first ladies more recently. You sort of choose a cause and then identify with it, whether it's literacy or something like that, that is essentially, transpartisan or nonpartisan. So Mrs. Hoover's great cause was the Girl Scout movement. Now, it might interest, well, as First Lady, she might have been de facto the head of the Girl Scout movement, but she had been before, and I think for a few years later. And I found a photograph, which I may include in my book in due course, of Mrs. Hoover and Mrs. Roosevelt when they met at a Girl Scout convention, I think in 1939, both in uniform, and they're yucking it up. They're all smiles. I can't find a photograph of Herbert and Franklin like that. So I hope that gives you just a snapshot into Mrs. Hoover's career. She died at the age of 70 in 1944. He outlived her by 20 years. And this is relevant to mention. Although Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt became political enemies and there was misunderstanding, two things. When the war broke out in 1939, the Second War, Roosevelt, through an intermediary, offered Hoover a chance to do something vague, but in Europe, having something to do with the relief, set up a relief commission or something when the Germans invaded Poland. It was Mrs. Roosevelt who was pushing that idea, and I think she wanted to be Herbert Hoover's colleague running the women's division, so to speak, of the relief effort. Well, for various reasons, it didn't happen. But when Mrs. Hoover died in 1944, and this is part of the public formality and correctness that they did maintain, despite their suspicions and so forth. When Mrs. Hoover died, the Roosevelts sent a condolence letter. And if my memory serves, Hoover sent a handwritten note to Mrs. Roosevelt and a formal typewritten note to Franklin Roosevelt, which may be interesting, may be revealing. When Franklin Roosevelt died a few months later, in April of 1945, Herbert Hoover sent Mrs. Roosevelt a very nice handwritten letter of condolence, which does survive, and it's in the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York. And so certain courtesies were maintained, which is nice to report. But of course, both the Roosevelts, Mr. and Mrs., had their differences with Hoover, and again, it would take a little while to go into all that, but that perhaps is somewhat illuminating, I hope.
One last question.
I see a hand raised in the back, yes.
There's this whole thing about history repeating itself, and you stated that Hoover quickly announced that the economic crisis was over. That has a familiar ring to it.
Well, I'm not sure there's a question mark at the end of that. Well, you see, he wasn't alone. I won't talk about current events, but he wasn't alone in thinking that. It looks terrible on paper now. Oh my goodness, Hoover said that. Incidentally, he never said prosperity is just around the corner. But he said things that, in essence, said something like that, very close to that, in those few months after the crash, before it was obvious that the thing wasn't going to turn around, and that the economy was heading downward rather than upward again. And as I say, he paid at the time, and he paid among historians for saying such things that were so far off the mark. But again, it was not until considerably later that the Great Depression became the Great Depression in public perception. It was really about 2 years into Hoover's presidency. In the first 2 years, I would say, and just sum up like this, in the first 2 years of Hoover's presidency, he was in a way ahead of the curve. Now, you may think that that was wrong, that he was too much ahead of the curve, he was too interventionist, but he was not criticized for being a stand-patter at all. But once the Depression really weakened in 31 and 32 and the relief issue rose and Hoover resisted the federalization of relief, increasingly he was pilloried and increasingly people started moving to his left, and he began a kind of defensive operation trying to hold the tide back, what he thought of as the socialistic tide that was coming. So the Hoover that many of us remember in stereotype, Hoover, the doer, the reactionary even, and so on. That's the later 2 years where he's resisting what becomes the New Deal tide, although he took considerable steps. I didn't even mention the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and some other major measures in the last year of his presidency, which, rightly or wrongly, were significant intellectual bridges toward the New Deal. So again, I'm giving you perhaps a little bit longer of an answer than I started on giving, but I hope I thereby suggest some of the complexity of just those 4 years. It's not static. Things were quite dynamic, but your point is taken.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Grand Valley State University. Visit us at gvsu.edu.